This is a presentation about feminist criticism as outlined in Peter Barry's book, Beginning Theory. When we talk about feminist criticism, we often associate it with the women's movement of the 1960s, at least when you talk about it from the Western context. But before the 60s, there were some sporadic voices that called attention to women's position in society, though not like the plethora of voices that came in the 1960s. I will list these voices here, so we have a background of this line of thought. The main three female voices when speaking about women's rights in the West are the British Wollstonecraft and Woolf, and the French de Beauvoir. Towards the end of the 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft called for the vindication of the rights of women by demanding their education. In 1929, Virginia Woolf published a book called A Room of One's Own and called for the need for women writers to have a space or place to write and money of their own if they are to be a match to male writers. Simone de Beauvoir studied women throughout history and exposed their positions as secondary citizens in her book, The Second Sex. There were also notable male voices in the late 19th century, such as John Stuart Mill, who worked with his wife calling for the equality between the sexes, with his article, The Subjection of Woman, published by his wife posthumously, and The Origin of the Family by Frederick Engels, who exposed the nuclear family as a new construct and matrilineal types of family where women ruled to be the norm in the past. In our part of the world, and at around the same time, Qasim Amin also called for the education of women in his book, The Liberation of Women. Before proceeding to look into more recent strands of feminist criticism, I'd like to draw your attention to terminology that is often confused in talking about women, or men for that matter. So remember not to confuse feminist with feminine and female. The feminist is a political movement or inclination, a stand taken to support women's position in society. Both men and women can be feminists. The feminine is a cultural description of characteristics that is bound to certain societies and times and changes from one society to another throughout history. These are characteristics often attributed to women in that specific time and place, though they may also be used to describe men who exhibit behaviors or characteristics associated generally or stereotypically with women in that given society and time. Female, the last term, is a more straightforward term that is a matter of biology. Now, the feminine is often argued as a construct that decides what is and what isn't a woman, seen in how women are represented culturally, again, in any given time and place. This representation is the stuff of feminist criticism, and the focus on it changed from the 1970s that called specific attention to the mechanisms of patriarchy that constructed this idea of what it is to be feminine or woman, seen in how male writers construct the image of woman, to the 1980s, when feminist critics started to look at other theories, such as Marxism, structuralism, and linguistics, and how they can contribute to the feminist discourse. At the same time, attention to representations of women by men shifted to look at how women write themselves. In looking at these representations of women, Elaine Showalter, an early voice in analyzing the situation and image of women, distinguished between texts written by men, which he called androtexts, and texts written by women, which he called gynotexts, and coined the term gynocriticism to denote the latter, the text written by women. In looking at these texts or representations of women, in addition to distinguishing between those written by men and those written by women, Showalter also designates three historical categories that highlight these types of writing, or rather the attention to them by feminist critics. In the 19th century, women's writing exhibited traits of what is called the feminine phase, where women writers imitate men writers. This changed towards the end of the 19th century, or just about before World War I, into what is called the feminist phase of rebellion, where the writing of women was radical and separatist or reactionary. Finally, by the 1920s onwards, the female phase is one that pays attention to how women themselves write, regardless of reference to male writing. Please note that this is just one category that helps us look at different viewpoints, and it is not bounding whether in terms of definition or in terms of time. The lines do blur, as with all theories and lines of thought. In all these various feminist discourses, theory plays an important role, whether embraced or rejected. In the Anglo-American strand of feminism, that is mainly based in the US, the discourse was skeptical of theory, and I will refer to this later, and focuses on analyzing works of literature as representations of women. Major voices among these are Elaine Showalter, Sandra Gilbert, Susan Gubar, Patricia Stubbs, and Rachel Brownstein. Most of this work appeared in the 1970s. Across the ocean, feminist criticism is more closely linked to theory. On the English frontier, feminists refer to and utilize a form of socialist feminism, employing concepts of Marxism in their discourse, such as seen in the works of Terry Lovell, Julia Swindells, Cora Kaplan, and Catherine Belsey, mainly active in the 1980s onward. Also on the European continent, French feminists are similarly and even more strongly invested in theory, as they take the theories of Lacan, Foucault, and Derrida to look into literature and its relation to the feminist cause. Key French feminists are Julia Kristeva, Hélène Cixous, and Luce Irigaray. These critics go beyond literature into analyzing language and representation in general. The relationship between feminist criticism and language is old. Fundamental with it is the question of whether or not there is a language that is inherently feminine, and what that could mean for the feminist cause. In A Room of One's Own, the book referred to in the beginning of this presentation, Virginia Woolf argues that language is indeed gendered, and that the great history of male novelists made the sentence in the novel a masculine one. She calls it a man's sentence, which seems to refer to language that is balanced and well-structured, as opposed to the woman's sentence, which has a looser sequence. Woolf compares writers who use both. Remember earlier the reference to phases of feminist critics, where the first phase is that women imitate men. This is what Woolf is referring to and criticizing, as she compares novelists of the 19th century to determine which among them is still trapped in copying man's sentence. Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot belong to that group, according to her, and who has been more capable of using a language more suited for her own use, and she uses the example of Jane Austen here. Dale Spencer also argues that language is not only masculine, but that it is not a neutral tool. It is rather a tool that patriarchy uses to express its viewpoints, and thus warns feminists to be wary and careful of using it without check. From these two views, there sprang some debate as to whether there is actually a language that is free from the bias of patriarchy. The French feminist Hélène Cixous referred to earlier talks about such language in her article, The Laugh of the Medusa. The article plays with language and its evasiveness and referential quality, as we see in presentations on post-structural criticism, for example, and even on psychoanalytic criticism. Cixous calls this type of language écriture féminine, or feminine writing, as she sees it as one that's linked to woman's physiology, and that in it women can transgress patriarchy. She therefore invites women to celebrate this type of language as their own and as stemming from their own bodies. This line of thinking, however, causes some issues with other feminist critics and writers, as it espouses or promotes essentialist thinking that traps women in her body, since Cixous indicates that it is the nature of women to write in a manner that is not structured or orderly or manly. Julia Kristeva is also a French feminist who further investigates this écriture féminine as she distinguishes between the symbolic and the imaginary, two Lacanian terms developed to present the stages of language that a child goes through. The symbolic being associated with entry into that, which comes right with and after the mirror stage, and which is linked to the child's awareness that he or she must adopt the rules of the father, the rules of patriarchy. Kristeva hails the earlier, imaginary language and refers to it as the semiotic kora that women possess, and that is linked to the less structured language of poetry. This semiotic kora is similar to the unconscious slipping into the consciousness that is investigated both in psychoanalytic criticism, but more notably in post-structuralist criticism, in its attention drawn to the evasiveness and inability of language to represent what the speaker intends it to present or to represent. The link to Lacan is just one of the many links feminist critics draw with psychoanalysis. In the beginning, it started with feminists such as Kate Millett, who in 1969 condemned Freud as the main source of the patriarchal view that degrades women. Later, however, Juliet Mitchell explained Freud by distinguishing between sex and gender, a distinction also made by Simone de Beauvoir in her famous statement, "One is not born a woman, rather one becomes a woman." Mitchell here explains that what Freud is presenting is not sex or biology, but rather gender or cultural construct. Thus also concepts such as penis envy are to be understood to metaphorically refer to women envying men their power and not their sexual organ. This line continues with Jane Gallup, who looks at Lacan from a similar perspective of the phallus, Lacan's own rehabilitation of Freud's penis, as not the organ, but the symbol of power it represents. Jacqueline Rose is another name in this trend that sees sexual identity as a social construct. As seen here, the American perception of theory is an antagonistic one, specifically maybe because theory, especially psychoanalytic theory, has become part of life in the United States in ways that it hasn't been in Europe. As criticism that embraces and branches into sociology, psychology, history, culture, and language, feminist criticism takes different shapes and directions. Feminist critics would rethink the group of work considered canonical, and try to locate women writers there, look at women's experiences, and attempt to analyze them, look into how women are represented in literature by men and women, analyze the otherness of women, examine power relations between men and women, investigate the role of language in normalizing what is not normal in terms of femininity and masculinity, look into whether biology is the main factor in determining women's position, explore the possibility of a woman's language or écriture féminine, and determine identity and how psychoanalysis is a tool to examine it. This is among many of the other directions taken by feminist critics. For an application of feminist criticism, we will look at how Gilbert and Goubart, two American feminist critics that I referred to earlier, analyze Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights. Gilbert and Goubart start by looking at the novel as a Bildungsroman, or a formation novel, typical in the 19th century, as a type of novel that portrays the protagonist as a young boy growing into a man after going through some tribulations that eventually leads to him or her discovering their true identity. The child growing up in this novel is, of course, Catherine. But unlike the typical male protagonist of such novels of Bildungsroman, the protagonist here is female, and as such, her growth is not into knowledge of herself, but rather denial of that self. Catherine goes through a process of castration when she meets the Grange. Her castration is then symbolized by their dog, the Grange dog, biting her leg, and with that, she starts denying her true identity. And finally, she dies when Heathcliff returns to remind her of what she lost, of what she really was. This is clearly a Freudian reading of the novel, with its main focus on castration. And in this reading, unlike main readings that see Edgar as more effeminate, he is here a man who denies her freedom, unintentionally of course, as a result her loss of identity. This is the comparison that is drawn between Heathcliff and Edgar.